All right, first one. If we're going to solve this, I would try to factor it if it is factorable. Looking at the answers, it's not. So when you can't factor, you're going to do quadratic formula, which is b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So as we go through this with the quadratic formula, we're plugging in a, b, and c. This is not currently in order. So a is the x squared, b is the thing with the x, and c is the number by itself. So it's out of order right now. Now that we got it labeled, we're good to go. A is 1, so wherever there's an A, we're going to put a 1. B is negative 3, so it's negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 3 squared. Minus 4 times A is 1, times C was 20. B is negative 3. So we got to work this out. I would start inside the square root with just this part right here. Oh, the positive right here, yes. Negative 3. So when we start on the inside of the square root, we get negative 3 squared is 9. Minus 4 times 1 is 4, times 20 is 80. 9 minus 80 is negative 71. Since there's a negative inside the square root, you would pull that out as an I. So it's got to be I square root of 71. Which we can already eliminate a couple answers. So it's positive 3 plus or minus I squared root of 71 all over 2. Since it's positive 3, that means it is C. When this is factored completely, what's one of the factors? So factoring, there's 4 terms. 4 terms, we're going to split and try factor by grouping. Whenever there's 4 terms, you try to split it and do factor by grouping. So from the 3x cubed plus 6x squared, we could take out a 3 and an x squared. We're left with an x, and we're left with a 2, positive 2. Then from the next part, we have negative 5x minus 10. We can take out a negative 5. Divide by negative 5, we get positive x. Divide by negative 5, we get positive 2. The parentheses match. That's one of your factors. X plus 2 is one of your factors. Then your other factor is that front stuff. 3x squared minus 5. So 3x squared minus 5 is a factor. So is x plus 2. That's not there. Factor completely. This has got 2 terms. Whenever there's 2 terms, we're looking for one of those tricks, like difference of squares, difference of cubes, sum of cubes. In this case, this is a minus, so it is a difference. And that is a cube, so it's going to be difference of cubes. We're going to first take out the common factor of 3, because both of these numbers can be divided by 3. So you get x cubed minus 27. Now these are both cubes. When we factor a difference of cubes, you start by taking the cube root of each thing. So the cube root of x cubed is x. The cube root of 27 is 3. Then we get the big parenthesis that follows it. And the trick that I tell you guys for this one is two parts. It's got SMS and SOAP. SMS means squared multiplied squared. So first we got squared, x squared. In the middle we get multiplied, x times 3 is 3x. And then the final s is squared again. We take the 3, we square it, we get 9. Then we fill in our signs with SOAP. SOAP means same, opposite, always positive. So we look at what we factored. We keep the same sign. Then we do the opposite sign. And then the last one is always positive. And that is factored. So our answer is D. Very similar question. It's got two terms, so we're looking for difference or sums of squares or cubes. Since it's got an x cubed, it's going to be different sum of cubes. First, we got a common factor of 9, so take out that 9. You get x cubed plus 1. And since these are both cubes, you do the cube root. The cube root of x cubed is x. The cube root of 1 is 1. Followed by SMS, squared multiplied squared. So square the first thing, multiply the two together, that's 1x. Square the back, that's 1. And then you fill in your signs with SOAP. It started with a plus, so same, opposite, always positive. D. Which functions are odd? So odd, since these are all polynomial functions, we're just looking for the exponents. That's an even exponent. That's an even exponent. And this would be x to the 0, which is an even exponent. So this is actually an even function because everything's even. 9 is an odd. 5 is an odd. And that's a 1, which is also odd. So G is odd. And then H, 5 is odd, 3 is odd, 1 is odd, but this would be x to the 0, which is even. So that's nothing. That's not even nor odd because it's got a mixture. G is the only odd one. F was an even function because all the exponents were even. Multiplying the complex numbers. If this is a calculator question, you can actually just type this into your calculator. Your calculator can completely handle these as long as you have an I button. This one does right here. Most of yours do. Five minus 7i. 6 plus 9i. And it can multiply it out. We get 93 plus 3i, which is A. So if you were not allowed to use a calculator for this for whatever reason, if you did this by hand, it's not hard either. You just multiply it. So you do 5 times 6 and 5 times 9i. So that would be 30 plus 45i. Then you multiply these. You get negative 7 times 6. Negative 7i times 6 is negative 42i. And then negative 7 times 9 would be negative 63i squared. The only thing you got to remember with this is you combine these. I squared is negative 1. So I squared is negative 63 times negative 1 turns out to positive 63. 63 plus 30 is 93. Positive 45i minus 42i would be positive 3i. So this is not a hard question to do by hand. It's even easier with calculator. write the solutions to the equations, or which is a solution to the equation. Your calculator can do these too. All you have to do is go into polynomial solver, F2. Since it was a quadratic, that means it's degree 2, and then you type it in, which was x squared minus 2x plus 21. So 1x squared minus 2x. We don't type in any of the x's, and then plus 21. So C is 21. When you hit solve, it tells us no real roots, which actually helps a little bit. We know it's not going to be C. You can go into your settings. So if you go Shift, Setup, we can change our calculator so it will show us imaginary answers. If you change it out of real and change it to imaginary right here, it will tell us imaginary answers too. The better your calculator, the better this works. This calculator is a little bit upgraded, so this one tells you 1 plus 2 root 5i and 1 minus 2 root 5i. So it's that one. If you were doing this by hand instead of a calculator, all you do is quadratic formula like we did on number 1. This is A, this is B, this is C, same sort of thing. So negative B plus or minus square root. So negative 2 makes positive 2. B squared, that's negative 2 squared. A is 1, C is 21. 2 times A is 1, so that's a 2 there. And then start with the square root, which is called the discriminant part of it. So negative 2 squared is 4. Minus 4 times 1, that's negative 4, times 21, 84. That's your square root part. So that turns into 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 81. Well, 80. All over 2. Negative 80 needs to be simplified. When you do that 80, I like to divide it into something that is a perfect square. So if there's a number that is a perfect square that goes into it, that's what we want to do. Perfect squares are 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 60, 64 will be in there, 36 will be in there. But going into 80, 16 is the biggest one that goes into it. So when you're simplifying square root of 80, 80 is 16 times 5, so that's the square root of 16 times the square root of 5. Square root of 16 is 4, the square root of 5 is the square root of 5. And since it was negative, that just means there's an I here. So 2 plus or minus 4i square root of 5 all over 2. If you're going to simplify this to get to this final answer, all you have to do is divide everything in the fraction by the same number. So like 2, 4, and 2, they can all be divided by 2. You get a 1, a 2, and a 1. And that's where we get our square roots, 1 plus or minus 2i root 5, which is where A came from. Solving this one out, since we have parentheses squared, the easiest thing to do is going to be to leave that alone and get that part by itself first. So our first step would be to add the 32. So you get 4 parentheses, x minus 8 squared equals 32. Then divide by 4. (32) divided by 4 is 8. Now, to get rid of the squared, we're going to square root both sides. And when we do that, it's plus or minus. So this goes to x minus 8 equals plus or minus the square root of 8. And that can be simplified the same way we did before. 8 can be 2 times 4, and 4 is a perfect square. So the square root of 8 is the same thing as square root of 2 times square root of 4. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 2 is the square root of 2. So 8 simplifies to be 2 square root of 2. So that's plus or minus 2 square root of 2. And to finish this, you just have to get x by itself. So you're going to add 8. Add 8. 8 does not have a square root of 2 on it, so you cannot combine those two pieces. So it just stays as 8 plus or minus 2 square root of 2. And it was a positive 8 plus or minus 2 root 2. This could be done if you graphed it. You could graph this function and get the roots. Since it equals 0, you could just do gsolve root. But that's going to be decimals on most of your calculators instead of this answer. Approximate the relative maximum and minimum of the function to the nearest tenth. So let's type that into our graph. Main menu, graph. It's 5x to the 5th. So calculate or approximate the relative minima and relative maxima. Minima would be the bottom, so where it turns around on the bottom. Maxima would be the top, where it turns around at the top. So right here looks like that might be a max, and over here looks like that might be a min, maybe. So we can go gsolve max. And it finds one for us right there. negative 0.33758. So negative 0.3. The y value is negative 1.9. And that's a max. So looking at our options, that looks like A is right, and so is D as far as the maxima goes. It could be A or D. This one's right, and that one's right. The other ones are wrong. So going back, now we can do the minima. Gsolve min. And it gets 0, negative 2. So our answer is D. Use the remainder theorem to determine if f of, that's written weird. That's not it. Shouldn't be an f there. X minus 2 is a factor. So if x minus 2 is a factor, that means there will be no remainder when we divide by x minus 2. Since we're dividing by just x minus 2, we can do synthetic division, which is much easier than long division. Synthetic division, we would put a positive 2, and then just the coefficients. Make sure we're not missing any degrees. Coefficients are negative 7, positive 10, negative 5, negative 9. And then synthetic division is just adding and multiplying. So we add negative 7 with nothing is negative 7. Multiplied by 2, you get negative 14. Add those two, you get negative 4. Multiply by 2, you get negative 8. Add those two, you get negative 13. Multiply, that's negative 26. Add those two, you get negative 35. Which means our remainder is not 0, which means it is not a factor. It's not a factor because our remainder is not 0. It's negative 35. Alternatively, you could just plug into instead of doing synthetic division, because that's the same thing, plugging into and doing synthetic division by 2. But then you have to do a lot of multiplying that I don't want to do. All right, division. Again, this is one that can be done with synthetic division because we're dividing by just x plus 1. So synthetic division, we put a negative 1 out front. And then on the inside, you got to notice, most importantly, that we are missing an x squared term here. So when we write it out, we got to put a 1x to the 4th, 1x to the 3rd, a 0x squared, a 5x, and then a minus 1. Make sure you get the 0, otherwise you're going to be messed up. Synthetic division is add and multiply. So add straight down, you get 1. Multiply, you get negative 1. Add straight down, we get 0. Multiply, we get 0. Add straight down, we get 0. Multiply, we get 0. Add straight down is 5. Multiplied is negative 5. Add straight down, we get negative 6. Negative 6 is our remainder. So negative 6 is going to go on top of the x plus 1, not positive 6. And then this would be our linear or our constant term. Linear, quadratic, this would be our cubic. So this is 1x cubed plus 5 and then minus 6 over x plus 1. So that's A. E almost tricked me. I almost didn't see that. Solving, you can solve by factoring, you can solve by quadratic formula, it doesn't matter. But either way, when you go to do it, you need everything on one side. So make that be 7x squared plus 20x minus 3 equals 0. Then you can factor. Now for these, when I factor, multiply the 7 times negative 3 is negative 21. We need two numbers that multiply to be negative 21 and add to be 20. That could be 21 and 1. 21 minus 1 would multiply to be negative 21 and add to be 20. So we split the 20 to become 21 minus x. Now this becomes a factor by grouping question, so we split it down the middle. That is 7 gets to come out. 7x gets to come out. You're left with x plus 3. A minus 1 gets to come out here, and you're left with x plus 3. Those match. That's a factor. And then the 7x minus 1 becomes your other factor. And then to get our solutions, we solve each of these. So we get x plus 3 equals 0, and 7x minus 1 equals 0. Divide by 7. You get x equals positive 1/7 and negative 3, which is A. If this is a calculator question, we could have typed this into our calculator and let the calculator do all the work. So we go to equation, polynomial solver. It's a degree 2. And we type in those coefficients we had. So that was 7x squared plus 20x. And then it was a minus 3 once we set it equal to 0. And you hit solve and you get your two fractions. You get your 1/7 and your negative 3. Same thing. And if your calculator is one of the more upgraded ones, it gives you the fraction just like that. All right, so we're doing a combination of functions here. Right here for f, it says that you're plugging in 2x. Wherever there was an x, you replace it with 2x. So in f, where there was an x, you replace it with 2x. So that's 2. X gets replaced with 2x squared minus 3, and that x gets replaced with 2x. And then for g, this is saying you're multiplying 3 times the whole thing. Plus 3 times the whole thing, 3x minus 4. So now this is just some algebra 1 stuff. 2x squared, you got to square the 2, you get 4. Square the x, you get x squared. Times 2. So that's 8x squared. Negative 3 times 2x is negative 6x. And this 3 has to be distributed. And then you combine like terms. So the negative 6x and the positive 9x, those get combined to positive 3x. So it is C. Number 14, factoring. Since there are 4 terms, we split it down the middle. We do factor by grouping. So on the left side, we can take out an x squared, and you're left with 2x plus 3. On the right side, we can take out a negative. 32 and 48 can be divided by 16. And we're left with 2x plus 3. 2x plus 3 is common. That's a factor. X squared minus 16, that's our other factor. But that could be factored More. The x squared minus 16 can be factored because that's got two terms and they're both squares. So we can factor that to be a difference of squares. X, now go to 4. So x plus 4, x minus 4. So that's A. Number 15, again, if you have a calculator, this is super easy. You just type it in. I to the 13th plus I to the 14th. I to the 13th plus I to the 14th. There it is, negative 1 plus I. This is C. If you're doing it without a calculator, what I do with it is you break it down into I squareds. This I to the 13th is a whole bunch of I squareds. It would be like I squared 6 times with an extra I. There's 13 i's altogether, so that's 2 times 6 is 12 plus 1 more. The I to the 14th would be like I squared 7 times. Then you just have to remember what is I squared. I squared is negative 1. So this is, instead of I squared, that's negative 1 to the 6th. And this is negative 1 to the 7th. Negative 1 to the 6th would be negative times negative over and over and over again. Since it's to the 6th, that turns positive. So this is a positive I. This negative 1 to the 7th, you're going to have, since you have an odd number of negatives, that turns to a negative. It's the same thing. Same answer. I minus 1 is negative 1 plus I. Same thing. Calculator makes it super easy. It's not too bad without a calculator either. Solving a system. If you have a calculator, again, this is super easy. You can make them both be y equals. This is y equals, we would add the x over. You get x plus 8. You can graph them both and see where they intersect, or you can go into equation solver. And since we've got 2 equations, we're doing simultaneous, which is F1. Oh wait, it's got an x squared in it. We can't do it that way. We've got to do the graph. So our first equation is x squared plus 6. The second equation is x plus 8. When you're solving, you're just looking to see where they intersect. So you can scroll up a little bit to see it better. There's 2 points of intersection right here on the left side, a little bit of the parabola, and then on the right side of the parabola. To get that intersection, you just do gsolve intersect. One of those answers is negative 1, 7. The other answer is 210. Negative 1, 7. And so that's 1 and 5, I and V. If you did this by hand, all you would do is set them equal to each other and solve it. So your algebra would start with x squared plus 6 equals x plus 8. And then you just solve it out. Move everything over, factor it. It does become factorable. You get your 2x values and stuff. Once you get those 2x values, so it'll be x squared minus x minus the 8 over, you get minus 2. This is factorable, like we said, x minus 2x plus 1, so you get x equals 2, x equals negative 1. That fits with what we had up here, x equaled negative 1 and x equaled 2. Once you get those x values, you have to plug them in right here. Figure out what the y value is that goes with it. So when we got the 2, you plug it in. 2 plus 8 is 10. That's the y value. When you got the negative 1, you plug it in. Negative 1 plus 8 is 7. That's the y value. You have to plug it in to get the y value. Or type it in your calculator, calculate, and get the intersect. These are possibly my favorite questions on the midterm. Just a lot of factoring and canceling. But we don't have to do it yet. These are my favorite, though. All right. There's two ways you could think about this. You could just look at the answers and see which one would turn into this answer since it is a multiple choice. So square root of something would have to get 8, which square root of 64 is 8. So it's highly likely it's going to be that one. Since it's got a negative in there, that's also going to create the I. That is exactly what we're looking at. Okay. The square root of 64 is 8. The square root of a negative is I. So it's 8I. It's that one. All right. Following characteristics. As x goes to infinity, that means as it goes to the right, the graph is going to positive infinity. That means up. So right side's up. It's not that one. As x goes to negative infinity, that means left. F of x goes to positive infinity. That means up. Left side up. That means it's not that one. And it has an absolute minimum. X equals positive 3. Absolute minimum means it's like the lowest of the entire graph. Nothing goes lower at x equals positive 3. This one looks like it's at 2. This one right here is at 3. That's it. So it's B.